Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Welcome to Friday Night Conversation, where we just talk about all things faith and life. We're really excited. We've got an exciting theme tonight. You can see it on the screens, and in the description, it's called The Joy of Missing Out. And we're going to get into that in just a bit. But first off, I'm just going to introduce the people that we've got on the panel tonight. So we've obviously got myself, I've got Angie next to me, and we've also got Musa.
Hey.
And on the other side of the studio, we've got Pastor Jonah and his wife, Becca. So we're all going to be talking about this theme. We're really looking forward to it. So I'm going to hand you over to Pastor Jonah, who's going to take us on.
Fantastic. Yes, Pastor Joe, thanks for that. And it's amazing to see a whole bunch of people joining in the comments. Hey guys, wonderful to have you joining us this evening. So as you'll be able to, you might have noticed if you're tuning in on YouTube, you'll see our theme for this evening is the joy of missing out. So it's a bit of a play on the phrase FOMO, like fear of missing out. Yeah, exactly. Current. Largely extrapolated by social media, this idea of FOMO. But I just thought that we'd just start off, bring us all onto the same page. So first off, let's just touch on what exactly is FOMO? What kind of impact does it have on us? And then why are we talking about Jomo, the joy of missing out, today instead? And why might that be a more healthy alternative? So why don't we go to Angie first, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, of course. I feel, FOMO obviously stands for the fear of missing out, as mentioned. And I feel like FOMO is like being in a situation where you're seeing someone do something or see someone have something, and you're like, I want that. And in a case of I want it, but wait, no, let me start again. I was like, wait a second. Fear of missing out basically means I want to go to everything because I don't want to miss out on any opportunities. I don't know where I was going with my first point. But
We made it.
It's a lovely we got summary. There in the end.
That's it. And so that's FOMO. And so then, Musa, we're talking about joy of missing out today. So why might that be helpful and maybe a more healthy alternative to this idea of FOMO?
I think it just flips the switch in terms of your mindset as well when we're talking about the joy of missing out. Because I think when Angie was talking about those scenarios or those opportunities of which we miss out of, they may not always be good for us.
Yeah.
And there could be some alternatives. There could be benefits of us actually not doing that and doing something which is far more better or far superior to what we were missing out on.
It's true, isn't it? This whole thing of FOMO, it's everywhere. Isn't it? It really is everywhere, and it's kind of powerful as well. Yeah. Because it's not just missing out on. I don't know if it's when a big TV show comes out on Netflix or something, and it's okay, so it's not just that I don't want to miss out on the TV show itself, but it's that I don't want to miss out on the conversations the next day, talking about it. I don't want to miss feeling included, all this kind of stuff. Whereas actually, Jomo, I love what you said there, Musa, just kind of talking about that and how actually, it kind of comes down to actually we enjoy what we're doing more than the stuff that we're missing. That's how I kind of think about it. Because I feel like otherwise, FOMO, you kind of just drift through life wishing that you were somewhere else. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think FOMO is very short term, isn't it? That's a lot of what I think. It's very kind of what I want here and now, whereas I feel like Jomo, what we're talking about, is almost that sort of the playing the long game kind of mentality of actually I'm gonna forego something now because I'm looking at something better in the future.
No, so good.
I'm
Okay,
just going to put in. I prefer Jomo because it's got my name in it.
There you go.
I just feel like it means more of Joe, so why not?
A little bit more of Joe. Well, we can hear a little bit more of Joe. Exactly. We can hear a little bit more of Joe. So let's kind of just contextualize this a little bit then. So, Pastor Joe, have you ever chosen then to miss out on something that was maybe good? To instead go for something great and kind of feeding into this whole idea of the joy of missing out?
That's a really good question. I think if I was to maybe pick one thing, like one thing that could be an example. I would think of when I went to university. I wasn't the most social of people. I wouldn't class myself as a social butterfly. But
Amazing comment.
What was that, Becca?
Amazing comment.
I know, there we go. But when I did decide to start being a bit social, I guess I had a bit of an option. I could either be social with, I guess, the people on my course and, you know, friends from halls and whatever, or I could be kind of social with people from church. And not that there's anything wrong with being social with people from my halls and my friends, but it was more the level to which I did that. So I actually decided to invest more time, I guess, in being in church and being plugged into church and creating friendships in that context. And that was where I kind of channeled most of my energy. So it's not that there's anything wrong with making friends on my course and that, and I did make friends, but I would say perhaps the depths of relationships that I formed were more with people from church. And I kind of feel like that was, you know, looking at something that had been really good and picking something that was even better, something that was even greater, because then the long-term effect that that's had on my life is a lot more than if I just formed, you know, just regular friendships.
You wouldn't know us.
I wouldn't know you guys. That's true.
You wouldn't be best friends with us. I know.
Okay.
There you go. No, I like that, because I guess it paints this picture that actually, you know, the decisions that we make with regards to these things, you know, I love what you said, Becca, earlier on about how FOMO is often short-term based, like, I want to be like up to date now so I don't miss out on that thing, you know, like that's happening tomorrow. But actually, when we live from a place of looking more long-term, we can actually get joy in the long term. No, I love that, Pastor Joe. So, Angie, what about you? I feel like it's story time, isn't it? So let's
Around the circle.
It kind of helps to make this more real, I suppose. So, yeah, what about yourself, Angie? Have you ever made a similar decision, or?
Yeah, I think quite like equally to Pastor Joe. I think like church being a big one, but more when I was younger. So I grew up in a church life, like church is all I've ever known. So all of my teenage years, I was in like youth ministry. Like Friday nights were like at church, and like so at school it would be like everyone would be like, oh, there'd be like parties or events to go to, and people would be like, oh, Angie, can you come? It's on a Friday. I'll be like, no, sorry, I'm at church. And in the moment, I actually remember in the moment or not feeling like that left out, but then at the same time did feeling left out because I was the only one going to church on a Friday where everyone else was going to parties, house parties, yada yada yada, and I was obviously, you know, going to church. But I feel like it's really interesting because looking back on it now, I feel like FOMO wasn't that present because I think, you know, FOMO looks at life as like losses, like what am I going to lose out on by not going to what everyone else is going to. But I feel like Jomo is like, what do I have to gain? So me growing up in youth ministry and like growing up in church really set like really core foundations in my life. And I have like so many friends that I consider like my family members, like, and then I can look to. And I really feel like being in youth was like highlight of my life. So I feel like it was FOMO in the moment, but looking back now I realize it was so much more. It was actually Jomo.
No, that's so true. That's so true. I love that line that you said there, that oftentimes FOMO looks at life where it's like, what have I got to lose? Whereas Jomo is like, man, what have I got to gain? I feel like that's such a helpful way to look at things. And like, so obviously that's something that you've seen now in like hindsight. Would you say that, you know, in the moment, I suppose it can kind of, I don't know, sometimes feel a bit different. Like what was it like kind of going through that experience? Were you like thinking ahead like in this kind of way?
Oh no, I definitely wasn't thinking ahead. Because it's hard because when you're a teenager, like everyone's having these experiences and you feel like you should be part of them and that you should be like doing, I guess, what the norm is as like a normal teenager, quote unquote. And so when people are doing something different, well, like I was doing something different, not that I was like ashamed, but I was kind of like, oh, like, am I not doing something right? But like, it was weird because being at church, like, obviously is a good thing. Like being surrounded in being in God's house is not a bad thing. But when everyone else is doing something different, it's like, oh, why me? And why do I have to be the one to do something different as well? So in the moment, no, I wasn't thinking about it, but I don't know how it worked. Well, God, obviously. I'm very glad how it worked out, though.
No, that's so true. That's so true. And I mean, I feel like it kind of feeds into this whole principle that, so here's a question then, just to kind of go off the back.
You'll have a big question.
Maybe we'll come back to some of the stories in a minute. But so sometimes something that a lot of Christians will say is, we're called to be people in the world, but not of the world. And, the Bible says that, Jesus said to go out into the world. So question then, where do we draw the line with that? Like, how do we handle that kind of tension? Like, is there like a one size fits all? Like, how do we kind of measure this whole stuff?
I see you looking at me, and that's a big question. I feel like I was hoping that was going to get shot over to the other side of the room. But that's okay. Here we are. So how do we draw the line? How do we get that balance between the two?
How do we handle the tension?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different directions that my brain goes in with that. I think one of them is that we've got the best example ever in Jesus, haven't we, really, in terms of what he did. And I think the whole concept of being in the world but not of the world, actually, I think it's really important to remember that we're still called to be an example to people. We're not called to just separate ourselves off and kind of pen ourselves in and say, oh, well, we've got ourselves sorted over here. You guys can all go have your fun and we'll be, the Christians. Like, it's not like that, is it? We were literally called to do the opposite and to go out into the world, but to still hold on to those values that Jesus taught and that are in the Bible, and the fruits of the Spirit even, I suppose, and to hold on to those kind of foundation core beliefs and not let those get lost when we decide that we've got a bit of FOMO.
So good.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think about that. There's a scripture in 1 Corinthians 9, I think 20 to 22, where Paul is writing is like, to the Jews I became like a Jew, and to the Gentiles. And I feel like sometimes we can take that out of context, and people might go, well, Paul said he became a Jew to the Jews, so I'm going to become what I need to become to whoever I need to become. And I'm like, well, like we can kind of take it all out of context. And what he was really saying was he did life with them, and he was a demonstration of how you can live a Christian life in any context. I feel like that's the important thing to remember, is that regardless of context, you can still live a life of faith. And so Paul was demonstrating in all these different contexts, I can still live a life of faith, so that I can show these people that it's possible, and by doing so, win them to Christ. So when we're going into the world, we're not going into the world to be influenced by the world, we're going into the world to influence the world.
So good.
Excuse me. And I think that's what that's getting at. And so, no, we're not, absolutely not. We're not called to be in a Christian bubble. I feel like the danger as well with the joy of missing out could be people thinking, okay, then that means I should only have Christian friends and I should spend every day in church. And no, that's not a complete life. There's a lot more to life than that. We should do life with people. That's why we're here on earth. We're here to do life with people, to form relationships. But whilst doing that, like Becca said, keeping our core values right there and keeping them on top, and making sure that we're actually bringing light to the world, as opposed to, if you just spend your whole life in a bubble, you don't shine in a light, do you? So that's why we're called to shine light, really.
Well, I absolutely love that answer. And I really like what you're saying about the relational aspect as well, because how you ever going to allow someone to see your point of view, or to really allow them to kind of have an understanding of the richness or the transformational power of God in your life, if you're nowhere near them, or if they can't even see it, as you said, like shine that light. It's like in John, it's just like Jesus talks about kind of taking the kind of cover off the lampshade as well. Put the light on the top of the hill so everyone can see, not just Christians, isn't it? But for everyone to see.
It's great.
No, that's so good, Musa. And, Pastor Joe, what you were saying there just about someone's just mentioned in the comments that line, not called to be influenced by the world, but to influence the world. And I know, I kind of think that, because okay, so Jesus said to go out into the world, but we're also, the Bible says that we're citizens of heaven. How, this world is not our home. So we shouldn't be, doing the same stuff, like acting in exactly the same way as just everybody else. Like, Becky, you mentioned how Jesus is our example. And actually, I kind of remember when Jesus went to the cross, it says that it was for the joy that was set before him,
Yeah.
that Jesus endured the cross, and how he actually had to miss out on stuff in the short term. Like in his lifetime, you know, when he was going to the cross, like the crowds were calling him a liar. Like he was not getting the recognition for who he was. He wasn't, you know, this is like God, like in flesh. He wasn't getting any glory, any of that. And he had to miss out on that. But then coming back to that for the long term gain, to be glorified and be seated next to the Father. And, you know, that it was that joy that was set before him. And so it's kind of interesting. But it also makes me think then, so if that's the case, if that's what God wants for us, then why is it that we have these, why is it that we have FOMO for things that are not good for us?
I think it's because we see the illusion that it's good for other people. I think that's a big part of what it is. Like you think about growing up, peer pressure is a big thing, isn't it? And like you were talking about, you know, like, you know, everyone's going, like, don't get me wrong, it's great to go out, you know, go for a house party on a Friday and hang out with friends and all that stuff. And so it's almost like when you kind of put stuff in the scale, or if you like the balances, is like sometimes we look at the benefits of other stuff as weighing more than the benefits of missing out on it. So I feel like it's that illusion. It's like seeing the result of, you see what it's all about, the future proof, because like the thing that you're missing out on, you can see what the result is and it looks good, but the thing that you're missing out on, it for, you can't necessarily see the end result quite yet. So it's almost an act of faith, because you're almost thinking ahead. You're like, okay, I'm going to miss out on this thing, even though I can see how good it is, because I believe that there's something greater. But that thing that's greater, you may not necessarily have a tangible way of quantifying that thing. So I think that that's not the only reason, but I think that that's definitely one of the reasons, is because we can actually see that other people are enjoying something, and then you probably feel like you're denying yourself, but you don't know what you're really denying yourself for.
I think that. Oh, sorry, Pastor Jonah.
You go ahead.
Oh,
Andrew.
no, I was just going to say off the back of that, I feel like it's that whole idea of like the grass is greener on the other side type of thinking. And actually, like what we think as you said, what we think we're missing out on is better, I guess, maybe than what God has in store for us. And I love how, Becca, you were saying at the beginning, it's that temporary, like having that temporary perspective of actually, because most of the time the things that are like we think we're having FOMO for are only going to give us temporary satisfaction or temporary joy. And so like we only, as you said, we get the temporary, the joy out of it, and that's why we feel like that's probably the better option. And anytime I think of like that, I think of a quote where it's like, you know, obviously the grass is greener. It says, you know, the grass isn't greener on the other side, the grass is greener where you water it. So I guess if you don't want to have FOMO and you want to have Jomo, I love these guys.
Jomo is just so nice, isn't it? It's just like, yes.
I know, it's so like succinct.
#Jomo, let's make it trend.
Just for you. But I guess if you want to switch perspective, it's kind of like, oh, then what in this situation am I looking to get joy out of, and how can I achieve that joy, and how can I guess make my grass greener on this side, so I don't have that perspective that I'm missing out on something. And sorry, to add to that, like, because it just kind of jogged in my brain there, almost like not having that mentality of watering the grass where you are is kind of it's kind of like absolving yourself of responsibility. So you just want to go to where it's ready made for you, to where like the happiness is ready made, and to where like the success is ready made, instead of putting the work in. And sorry.
No, wow, that's a really good point. Like, are you sure you don't have anything?
No, I'm good.
No, that was really good. And it was just, sometimes it made me think about, you know, when we had that fear of missing out in some seasons. And for example, even if it's like, I say hanging out with your friends, you're not, like growing up in the African household, I'm not, maybe Joe can resonate with this, but my mum used to be so strict, honestly. Mum, can I go play with everyone else outside? No. No, absolutely.
Why?
No.
No reason.
And then I guess I'll have that fear of missing out when everyone's having those conversations, etc. And then I go out and maybe I hang out with my friends or so in a park or something. I'm just like, this is what everyone's talking about? I'm just like, this isn't that great, is it? It sounds like you just, really? I was afraid of missing out on this. Like, I'd rather sit at home and eat my mum's rice, you know?
Now that is something that you do not want to miss out on.
There's joy in that.
Sweet rice.
No, that's so true, isn't it? And I feel like, Musa, just even in just that story, you can kind of see how, it may be a lighter fashion to what Pastor Joe was also getting at, which is when we act on our FOMO, we do miss out on stuff. It's like almost like if we're following our FOMO, like, man, like we could be missing out on stuff like our contentment, like stuff like our peace,
Yes.
like stuff like our joy. And like, I feel like, is that worth the trade? Maybe not. And so I suppose so that's kind of interesting, but also where this can get tough is then, okay, it's one thing where we get to decide what we're going to miss out on and what we're going to, get to do. But then what about where it's the circumstances that dictate, what you miss out on? For example, just thinking in this season of things like COVID, we've all missed out on stuff that we may otherwise have been able to do and to be engaged with and to experience. How do we carry that Jomo mindset in situations like that?
That's a big old topical question, isn't it?
Ones.
I know. I see you looking at me. I see you picking me up.
I'm going to leave. Just call me back when you've answered it. So I don't have time.
I'm glad I'm down here this week. I'm not going to lie.
I think my mum's calling me.
So I think it has to be trust, doesn't it? You have to trust in a bigger plan and a bigger picture. Certainly, I think that's what I've got to do. COVID... There's no way to look at the stuff that we've lost and I think be joyful about that. I don't think that's the point of the joy of missing out, is not trying to make light of things that are really difficult, because people have lost and we have missed out, not by any kind of choice. And I think that's filled with tragedy, isn't it? But I think where faith comes in is saying that I am going to trust that there is a lot more going on behind the scenes than I know about. My life is a drop in the ocean of eternity. And I think if I'm going to stop now and give up on faith when it gets hard, then I've forgotten all the good stuff that's happened and I'm not trusting the good stuff that will happen in the future.
Oh, wow, that's so good. That's such a good perspective, not trusting the stuff that will happen in the future. I love that.
That's really good. Your question, Jonah, just makes me think of a scenario about when the circumstances are out of your control. I just keep thinking back to, I think it was my final year of university, actually. So absolutely fantastic year. So I used to play rugby. I was doing really well, actually. And at this time, I think it was like January time or so, and I got called up to like the provisional English student squad. I was like, oh yeah, this is great. I was like applying for jobs. I was like, okay, I'm going to nail this. And then I'm just like, oh God, thank you for giving me these talents. And like, I'm going to absolutely use this. And then I get injured. Massive injury, as in, I guess looking back at it now, I was almost out for like 10 months or so with injury after the other. And I almost found myself in the space where I was like, but I really wanted to do that. Like, I really wanted to have that opportunity or so to really like play rugby to a really high level. And I feel, especially what Becca said about like kind of looking at sometimes what I could gain in that season as well. And in that time, I was actually able to kind of invest more time into kind of, serving in church, because obviously I wasn't training to the same amount of time. I was able to actually fully apply to jobs, and really thankful that even in that time of which I was out, I was able to get a job, etc. And then I look back and I just kind of look back up in the actual season. It was really difficult, but I look back and see what God was doing to me in that season, and how he was kind of like shaping me, how he was testing me, how he was providing me those avenues to overcome those certain challenges. So for example, even just having the people in that situation, in that time, because I remember, I think it was, so yourself, Pastor Joe, yourself, Pastor Jonah, and Pastor Fraser, I just dropped some guys a message like, guys, this is like, a lot is going on here. I like really need a community around me. And just having those guys in that time to actually pray for me as well was absolutely phenomenal. And I just even look back, I was just like, well, if all things went well, I'd have like missed that job opportunity, which would have missed out on me staying in London, which would have missed out on me having some really good job opportunities, which would have missed out on me even getting further stuck into the Junction Church and all the amazing things which is happening here. And I think it's great. I could look back and just see the amazing things. But in that season, I think it was kind of what Becca's saying about kind of that almost gripping onto that faith and allowing people around me as well to speak faith into that situation, and why like community can never be underestimated in those times.
100%. It's like, I mean, hindsight, or for me, hindsight is like a brand new pair of Specsavers, isn't it? It's just like 2020 vision. It just makes so much sense, you know, and I resonate with that. When circumstances kind of just take it out of you, you know, I think back to when I graduated university, for example, and it was just like nobody wanted to hire me. And I was like, what's going on? And I remember missing out on so many jobs, and it wasn't that I chose to miss out on them. I just, you know, and thinking at the time, like, what's going on? I'm missing out on so much. And I'd made a decision that I wanted to stay with the Junction Church. So I was obviously faithful to that decision. Now, when I look back, I can see how God was working everything out for my good. And it's amazing how you look back and you see the way God works it out. So that's why what Becca's saying about faith is so important, because it will never feel like that in the moment. Like you will never feel like, oh, this is going to work out great. But that's where you just have to put your foot down, have some grit, and just remember how it's worked out in the past. Remember, Pastor Roy talks about, remember God's track record. And I think that's how, like, because that's real life, Pastor Jonah. That is real life. It's when, you know, like, it's all great to say, yeah, I'm going to miss out on this and this, but what about when life happens and you have to miss out on stuff, or you find out you've missed out on opportunities and stuff, and you feel a sense of loss. And I think, like, in that moment, that's where real faith comes in. You've got to believe that so in the end it will all work out, I think.
Definitely.
That's so true. And I feel like something that we've touched on it whilst talking about this, especially Musa, when you were sharing about your experience, was the impact of community and what a difference that can make to our mindset, I suppose, when we miss out on stuff due to life circumstances. And so I wonder if we could just touch on that a little more. Angie, what impact does community have to our mindset with regards to the joy of missing out and when, you know, life happens?
Yeah, no, definitely. I feel like just the influence of good community you can never underestimate. Being surrounded by like just good people. I mean, there's that that quote where it says like you're the accumulation of what, like 5 most people you hang around with. So if you're hanging around with 5 people who are like, woe is me, like, you know, negative thoughts, like everything's wrong with the world, then obviously then your outlook when you miss out on something is going to be like, oh, everything's wrong with the world, yada, yada, yada. But if you're around people who, as we've talked about, are faithful, who've got good track record, who, you know, don't just speak to your situation now, but actually are believing for your future as well. I feel like you're setting yourself up to win by putting yourself in good community and being surrounded by people who are not gonna I guess like pressure you to come down to their level ultimately, because, you know, I feel like when you've got good people around you, all they want to do is like lift you up and bring you up. And especially in situations where you feel like you're missing out, but you're having to miss out for, I guess, a greater purpose as well. It's always nice to have people that are going to give you a bigger perspective, not going to let you sit in tunnel vision, but going to say, look, this is where you are now, but God's still going to carry you to somewhere greater as well.
Yeah. You're right. Go for Rebecca.
No, after you, Pastor G.
Oh, thank you very much. What's the biggest difference between FOMO and JOMO? It's that word you said there. It's perspective, isn't it? Like that's literally what it is. And that's why surrounding yourself with good people who've got good perspective is really helpful, because when you find yourself losing that bit of perspective, then, you know, then you can, and that's why what you were talking about, Musa, like, you know, being humble enough to send out a text and go to people, you know, this is a situation I'm facing, what do you think about it? And then they can help you shine some perspective on that, which can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I also think it's just the realness of having people, and exactly like we've just had here, the power of testimony and story of what other people have been through and what other people have experienced. I think you need that realness when you're going through something, when you're in the middle of it and you're kind of waiting for an answer. And actually you get into a community like the Junction Church and you can't go 2 steps without meeting someone who didn't get that first job that they wanted, or someone who didn't get the healing that they expected, or someone who didn't have a house that they wanted, but then God did something better. And actually I think as people, I think we touched on it earlier, that it's really relational, isn't it? When you've got a community like this, actually we don't need a kind of statistic that says, 1 in 3 graduates get a job or something. So, kick out 2 people and you'll be fine. That's not really, that's not the advice you need, is it? What you need to hear is that someone else has been through it with God by their side and came out the better for it. I think that's all the encouragement we need.
Yeah. It's so true. And, I love our community at the Junction Church because, actually, in our life group and, in other, hearing stories from other life groups, you just hear stories from people who are going through stuff and who are, missing out. And maybe it's a job, or maybe it is, a health thing or a family thing or whatever it is. But actually just spending time with other people who are choosing to lean into the joy that comes from God.
Yeah.
It's infectious.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's one of the things about community is that these mindsets and stuff, they are infectious. And, kind of looking at that whole idea of, who's around us, who's our crowd, and how we influence other people. Well, if I want to influence other people, I'd better make sure that I am getting myself full up on good community so that when I go out, I'm ready to go. I find that so helpful. Angie, you look like you have something to say.
No, just really. I'm like, when do I jump in? No, I was just sorry, I keep hitting the mic. I was just going to say off the back of that, I feel like it also deals with the mindset of actually, we're not that good by ourselves. And I feel like, we all go through situations and sometimes we think, oh, it's just me. It's just me going through this. It's just me struggling, especially when you miss out, and you're comparing what you're going through to what someone else is going through. And it looks like their life is just rainbows and sunshines and your life is just not. But
Storm clouds.
But when you are surrounded by, I love what Pastor always says, we're just, we're not that good. We're good, but we're not that good. And we need people around us. We need people who are gonna, as you said, Pastor Jonah, just fill us up with faith and with encouragement, with so many things, because life is not meant to be done by ourselves. Yeah, we might miss out on things, but we don't miss out by ourselves. People are still struggling. I'm not saying we all struggle together, but what I mean? That there's community for a reason. And I just wanted to add that, basically.
Love that, Angie. That's such a helpful thought as well. And just to lean into that further then, I suppose that, whether we decide to go for something great, let's say that that's how this happens. But then even then, the journey is not always going to be, what was it you said, rainbows and sunshine?
Rainbows and sunshine.
It's not always going to be like that. And so I guess the question is, how do we avoid resentment coming in on the journey?
Oh, man.
Gosh.
Pastor Joe?
Every
time. Just, you can have that one right back.
That's a great question. I saw a video that popped up on my Facebook. I'll get to the point. I saw a video that popped up on my Facebook, and it's this guy. I think his name is Lewis Pugh. I think he's a swimmer who swims the English Channel and stuff, right? And so he was saying when you're doing that swim, it's a very, very difficult swim. And what you have to do is you've got to think of one thing that's your why. Because he said, you will get tired and your body will get weak and all that stuff. You've got to think about one thing that's your why and just keep that one thing in your mind and do not take your mind off of that one thing. And that's how you get through. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. You can apply that to anything, really, because then when you decide to go for something that's great over something that's just merely good, and you get to that part of the journey that's not rainbows and sunshine, you've got to remember the why. And I think you have got to be so invested in your why because that is the reason. And obviously, we can talk about having community as well and a support structure, and that's very, very important. But almost that stuff doesn't work if you don't have a why. So you need to have a why that you can build a support structure around, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So good.
Yeah, I think that's really true, actually. And I guess to put a story to that, I suppose, it's kind of our story. That's nice,
you can
isn't it?
Oh,
thanks.
Right. Getting comfortable.
Too much, yeah, strapping. I was studying uni in Cardiff and you were based in Loughborough, and we were doing a long distance relationship, and you were part of the Junction Church, and I guess kind of had a long distance relationship with the Junction Church too. If that's a thing.
I love that. That is brilliant.
Anyway, so I was studying a long course. I knew I was going to be there for 5 years, and you were going to finish uni after 3 years, and the plan had been that you were going to move to Cardiff, because that made sense, because I was still going to be there for uni. But actually, we kind of got to that point, and the point of decision. The great point of decision, the point where it wasn't rainbows and sunshine, where actually we kind of realised that this community, this church was so where you were meant to be, and so where God wanted you to be and had so much purpose.
And I would say where he wanted us to be.
Yeah, absolutely, in our relationship. And I think that was, a really tough pill to swallow at the time. It seemed like what was going to be good was you moving to Cardiff so that we could be together, carry on our relationship, not 300 miles away from each other. But then actually what God was saying is, if you can hold out, then it's going to be great when I could then move here. But we're talking about 2 years. Like, that was 2 years longer of doing long distance. And actually, I think when you talk about resentment building up, that was always the kind of fear. But actually, Pastor Joe, I think that's so true, the holding on to the why. Why are we doing this? Because we know that there is purpose for you in Loughborough, there's purpose for me in Cardiff, there's purpose for us together when we can be together at the end of it, but there's also purpose for us now in terms of the amount that we grow in our relationship. And actually, I think I don't regret that. We don't regret that decision. But if you'd asked me about it at the time, it was really difficult.
No, it's so true, isn't it? And I feel like that holding on to that why, it just reminds me again of that thing about Jesus at the beginning, the joy that was set before him. And we've talked about Musa, I think you talked about faith and how faith is not focusing on what we can see now, because oftentimes the thing that we can see now is, it can be the thing that we need to miss out on to get to the thing that we can't yet see, but God has got ahead of us. Any further points on that one?
Not further points, but a question.
Bring it.
Interesting.
The man said any further points. You got a question? Anyway,
No,
you got a question. I'm just trying to dodge it if it's difficult.
It might be a question that's kind of already been asked, but just to delve into deeper, all of you guys have shared, your stories of situations where you've missed out, and obviously we're talking about the joy of missing out. So how practically do we find joy in these situations, especially because we've all talked about hindsight after the fact we found the joy, but in the midst of it, where is the joy when we don't know what the purpose is, we don't know what our why is, our faith, we have it, but still, how do we find joy?
I would say two things on that, just to kick us off, if that's all right. Did I hear someone else start to speak?
No.
I'm just going to go.
Too bad, you're speaking now.
I'm going to say two things.
Take the camera.
I feel like first off, if we're talking about following God and our relationship with Jesus, I feel like there is some kind of supernatural element that we don't quite get, where, joy of the Lord, it comes from God. We don't understand it. But I feel like that's got to be part of it. But then secondly, going back to the community thing, I feel like that's a huge part of it. So this might not be as a full-on example as maybe the ones that we've shared and other ones, but so when we think about serving in church, so there are hundreds of people in the Junction Church who, when we're having in-person services, say, will miss out on a Sunday morning lie-in, who will get up really early, who will go and serve half the day, some people the entire day, and they'll miss out on that whole day. But then you ask any one of them what they're experiencing, and you just see smiles on faces, you see people laughing. The experience is fun, the experience is joyful, the experience is, we love to do this. And I feel like in that moment, it's because if you have a group of people who together are deciding to miss out on stuff, whether that's the same thing or different stuff. Maybe we're missing out on things in life that are different to one another, but actually the very fact that we have one another, and maybe we're holding out for a joy in the future, but we can have joy in relationship now. And I feel like that's a huge part of where we can find joy right now. I don't know what anyone else had to
I think it's important to distinguish between the joy of missing out and that the joy is not in what we're missing out. It's not that we find joy because we missed out on something. Things start and things end, so you can't root your joy in those because they will finish eventually. So our joy has to be rooted in the thing that doesn't, that, you know, in the God that has no beginning and no end. That's where our joy is rooted in. And so then that means that that's a constant joy. That's that joy of the Lord that you're talking about, Pastor Jonah. So when I'm going through, and that's a very real question that you asked, because when you're going through that whole process of missing out on something and you don't quite know what the purpose is yet, but you know who your God is. And so that's where your joy is rooted in. And so then eventually out of that comes purpose, because remember, we're missing out on what we know to grow into what we don't know. And so when we miss out on what we do know, and we know all the parameters and we know everything about that stuff, but we've got a God that's bigger than anything that we can ever, you know, indulge ourselves in. And so root myself in that, and then out of that comes a purpose to something greater. And I think that that's the important distinction. It's knowing, okay, yes, we're talking joy of missing out, but my joy is not, I'm not joyful because I missed out on this thing. I'm joyful because I've got a relationship with God, and that's where my joy is rooted in. And out of that comes a purpose to do greater things and to make my grass greener where it is, and all of that stuff as well.
I love that.
Wow.
So good.
Yeah, I was going to say a very quick point as well, that I think all of this is completely true, and that it all speaks as to why we call this the joy of missing out, not the happiness of missing out. That we're not talking about, excuse me, those kind of like moments of happiness. As you say, it's not about, oh, I missed out on something, but I'm happy about it. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about joy. And, you know, that could be a whole nother conversation about the difference between the two. But I think remembering that joy is that kind of like depth of feeling, isn't it? Like really in your spirit, and that only comes from God, I think, personally. And so that is much more of a kind of longer spirit that's sort of coursing through you as a constant, I think, rather than those kind of like quick fix FOMO.
So good. Now I love that joy of missing out, not happiness of missing out. So good. Okay, so going back to Jesus then, so just flipping here a little bit. When Jesus called his disciples then, he called them to leave everything and follow him. So then how does that, so I guess in a practical way, when we're walking with Jesus, I suppose we've touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if we could elaborate. How does walking with Jesus help us to have joy in the stuff that we're missing out?
Because I feel like when we're walking with Jesus and when we're more in line, and when we have that closer proximity, we're aligning our will with his, we're aligning our will with God's will. And I think even sometimes in those times where I guess we have this fear of missing out, I think because we have that almost that closer alignment of will, we could see the fuller picture, in not the sense of that final destination, but we have a sense that God is good.
Yeah.
He's working for me in this. So regardless of what's happening right now, I know that I could trust in him, in his character, in his track record, as Pastor Joe mentioned earlier. And I feel like that's the thing which helps us, knowing that we could just trust in him and that alignment of our wills.
So good, so good. Final question. What about prayer? So how does prayer...
That was going to be the whole question. What about prayer? Discuss.
We did an episode last week all about, am I the only one who struggles to pray? Which I feel like was really helpful for a whole lot of people.
Amazing. The stories were brilliant.
So if you are listening to this and you've not heard last week's episode, definitely go back and check that out. But when we have a prayer that we're believing for God to answer, and it feels like we're missing out on the answer to that prayer, how do we handle that in our prayer life? It's one thing to say, okay, we're trusting, but how do we actually handle that whilst praying to God?
I think, again, there's lots of different ways you can answer that question. I think one of them, is honesty. I think God wants you to come to him and to be honest. I think the other thing is persistence. I think Zara brought up the story last week, actually, speaking about that, of the persistent widow who kept coming to God, that actually not being discouraged by not hearing from God or not having the answer that you wanted, but continuing to keep going. And I think it's that kind of, again, it's what Pastor Roy talks about, isn't it? The trudge of faith, that kind of the daily step. It's not about sprinting to a miracle. It's about trudging in the name of God just every day.
So good.
Yeah, that was great, and I think absolutely, Becca. It's all about that daily walk. It's about faith. That's the reality of it, isn't it? And that's where everything that we've talked about so far comes into play. Having community, having a great why, keeping the faith going. My gosh, we're out of time. We've been going for a while, and I'm just looking at some of the comments in here on YouTube, because we're live on YouTube as well as Spotify and other podcasts, and people are just bigging up what you guys have been saying. I think people have found that really, really helpful. I think if I was to take one takeaway from this, I think it's perspective. I loved when you kind of brought that in, Angie, towards the start, and I think that's the key thing to take away from today. It's like, when we talk about the joy of missing out, it's thinking, how can I align my perspective with God's perspective? And then in that, I can find joy. And I think, that's something that we can all take away and think about, and something that I found really personally helpful. So yeah, that was really, really good. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today to FNT Friday Night Conversation. Can I encourage you to, if you're on our YouTube channel watching this, please subscribe and please like the video, share it with your world. It's really good stuff. We've got more of these coming out, and we've got so much content as well on our YouTube channel, The Junction Church, where we put up loads of amazing stuff. You can also catch this podcast on any platform where you listen to podcasts, so that whether that's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google, wherever it is you listen to your podcast, we are there for you. And can I also encourage you to support us, support The Junction Church. We really appreciate your generosity. There is a link in the description below where you can give to the Junction Church. It's www.junctionchurch.net/give, and you can click on that link and support what we're doing as a church, and really help us to reach our community. So thank you so much again for tuning in tonight. Thank you to all the guys who've been on the panel tonight. Angie, Musa, Pastor Jonah, Becca, you guys have been amazing. It's been so good to chat about this. Thank you guys, and we'll see you next week.